So what is stabilized tracking? Stabilized tracking is a system for taking your mesh and stabilizing it and allowing you to track on it. So let's just go over some of the areas where you might make mistakes. Right now we have 4 points tracked. And if we enter the stabilized tracking tab, you can't actually do anything in here because you don't have a mesh. So the first thing you have to do is create some sort of mesh. Now when I enter the stabilized tracking tab, you'll notice that this mesh has been cut out and it remains in place and it's stabilized, and it's going to allow you to track areas with more precision. So for example, if we take a look at this eye here, that's bouncing around a little bit. I'll track that. And now you can see this is following this motion correctly. And I'll move back to the tracking tab. And now this point is exactly where it's supposed to be. So this tab here just holds your video still, so it's easier for you to track points that are moving around a lot. However, maybe you wanted to track these 4 points, but that's not possible because they're part of the mesh. So one fundamental concept of stabilized tracking is that anything that's part of the mesh can't be tracked or altered by stabilized tracking, only points that are inside of the mesh. So maybe one more example of that, I'll create another point here, and now that's inside of the mesh. Actually, let's create another point outside of the mesh too. When we move into the stabilized tracking tab, this point can't be used in any way. This one can actually be tracked. So I'll track forward. And again, this point was unaffected. It can't do anything if it's not on the mesh. And this other point here has totally tracked properly. Again, moving back to the tracking tab. Let's say, however, that you wanted these points to be improved with stabilized tracking. One of the ways you could do that is remove them from the mesh. In this case, I'm holding Alt-Shift, clicking and dragging, and cutting that out of the mesh. And then I need to create extension points to make this part of the mesh. So I'll hold Control-Alt-Shift and click on Windows, Command-Alt-Shift and click on Mac, and expand my mesh, auto-triangulate, and again, I'll just kind of cut this guy out. And now this is inside of the mesh. And when I move, this isn't going to look so good. So let's turn on Interpolation, and this is just our system for making our points follow the living points. So these extension points that aren't tracked to the horse, because obviously they're over the sky and they would never track there, they're just going to follow along with the motion of the other points. So now that this point isn't part of the mesh, when we move into the Stabilized Tracking tab, that point is here. And you can see that's probably tracked on there pretty close, not totally perfect, but again, we can track it in here. So the key takeaway is that something has to be on top of the mesh and not part of the mesh to be tracked by stabilized tracking. Let's go over another technique. I'm just going to track a point on the eye here, and actually I'm going to bring down the tracking quality because I don't want this to look very good. I just want to create a realistic use case where a track isn't perfect. So we'll say for whatever reason we have this point and we're tracking the eye and it's drifting a little bit. So for example, on the first frame, where is it? See, this is one of the issues with tracking in the main window, is that it's very difficult to stay zoomed in and zooming in and out. This is why the Stabilized Tracking tab is awesome. This should be somewhere over here. So how would we refine this if we only have one point? We would create extension points around the eye, and then create a mesh around the eye. And you can see that this mesh is following because we have interpolation set to on. And let's enter the Stabilized Track tab. From here, we can take this point and we can refine it further. So we can scrub along and we can make our adjustments, putting it exactly where it needs to be. And we can use our track refinement process to retrack. That looks better. And of course, we can add more points in tracking here too. So because this is stabilized, these points are going to be very easy to adjust. I can move back and forth between the first frame and the last frame by clicking left from this frame here, and it starts back up over there, or right from the last frame at the end. And it gives us an idea of where our points are moving. So I'll just make those adjustments and bring these back into their places. And move back into the tracking tab. If I'd like to, I can clear the mesh and auto triangulate the mesh. And now when I move back into the stabilized tracking tab, we're totally stabilized around the eye, and it should become even easier to track new points because there's less motion. So just for example, I'll do that. Switching back and forth between the first frame and the last frame, and making any tiny subpixel adjustments. And again, moving back into the tracking tab, I can attach these to the mesh and move back into the stabilized tracking tab. So you're going to notice something, and I created this error on purpose. Right now, these points are looking kind of strange. So let's talk about how and why that happens and how to fix it. Let's say that we created our lockdown mesh frame on this first frame. And just for example's sake, this first frame is slightly over on the right of the image, and then this last frame is over on the left. So just toggling back and forth between these two frames. I'll press Set Lockdown Mesh UV Frame here, and that's going to take these points and create a UV layout based on this frame. However, what can happen is if I go to a later frame and I create a new point that's outside of the mesh, so for example, I'll create a point here that's just above the center of the mesh. This point's UVs are actually created at its current position in time because it doesn't know where it is relative to the mesh on a different frame. So going to the stabilized UV layout, it's exactly where we left it. This is where it was supposed to be. And that's because it was created on the last frame and given UVs on the last frame, yet these other points here were given their UVs on the first frame. So let's just attach this to the mesh. And the quick solution to this is when you add new points, go to the frame you've been using, your lockdown mesh UV frame, and press the Set Lockdown Mesh / UV frame. Now all these positions are going to be set on the UV map, and when we enter the Stabilized UV Layout tab, you'll notice their positions are exactly the same as they were on that first frame. So in short, create a new point on the wrong frame. It's going to go in its position that it was on that frame. To fix it, go to your frame you've designated as the lockdown frame, press this button, attach it to the mesh, and now it's in the right position. So to finish this tutorial, I just want to redo it using a far more difficult shot than the previous. So this shot, I'm not saying it's a worst case scenario, but it is very annoying. So let's just say, for example, I was trying to track this point and make adjustments. Well, as I move frame to frame, I would have to keep moving and following. I'm specifically not tracking right now because I just want to show what this tool is meant to avoid. And having to constantly zoom in and zoom out and go on different frames and follow that there. And now this is out of view again and chasing it down and placing that point. So in a way, you're really kind of fighting with the zoom and the positions here. Oh, that's even the wrong shoe. I almost made that mistake. That's one of the things that can happen. So this is where stabilized tracking comes in to make your life a lot easier. So I'm just going to delete that point. Once we've tracked a single point on the shoe, I would just create a mesh around this. So I'm going to zoom out, create a fairly wide mesh. I'll auto-triangulate it, and then turn on interpolation. So now this mesh is following the shoe wherever it goes. And I had already done this shot, so I know I had to make it a little bit extra long, but the point is you want the shoe in the whole time. So we'll find a frame that we want to track on. So whatever, this frame is as good as any. I'll create my lockdown mesh UV frame here, and go into the stabilized tracking tab. And as we scrub along, you can see this is kind of stabilized. Not totally stabilized, but at least I'm not chasing all around the frame when I zoom in and having to go panning and scrolling and looking for it. So it's a step up even with just one point. So now let's try to track the overall motion of the shoe. I'm going to find a point. I think this is a pretty good one that we can start to track. So I'm just going to track this forward. And it's not doing a bad job. I could make corrections as I go, as this might slightly drift, so I'll just kill the tracking. Scoot that over. And just for the record, that is going to blend between these two. Maybe even just for example's sake. I'll correct that back there. But anyway, continuing on with this track. At least this point is entirely on screen while I'm tracking. Starting to get a little bit lost, I'll just correct that. And again on that last frame, I'll just make another correction. Okay, so now we can move back into the main tracking tab. So the point that I want to emphasize is that tracking a first point like we showed with that detail out here is a huge pain when the shot is moving all over the place and the shoe is trying to get away from you, right? See how fast I'm scrubbing? You can't follow that motion at all. Inside the stabilized tracking tab, even with 1 point, at least you can kind of mostly follow the motion. It's a huge improvement with 1 point. And then we're going to have a really huge improvement with 2. So let's clear the mesh, auto triangulate. Again, we'll go to the frame that we decided that we wanted to work on. Let's toggle off interpolation and then back on. So now these points are going to actually follow the 2 living points. Once again, just a reminder of what interpolation does is that I've just turned it off. You can see these 2 light blue points, these are tracked throughout the shot, right? These points we would call living. And then the extension points, they aren't tracked to anything because they're not actually part of the shoe, they're just surrounding it. These we would call dead. So when we turn on interpolation, the dead points follow the living points. And just do their best to follow as a complete mesh. Okay, so anyway, pressing the Set Lockdown Mesh UV frame and entering the Stabilized Track tab. Well, now this is a completely different shot. See how this is moving? Actually, maybe this is a little bit disorienting when the shoe is on its side. So maybe I'll go back to the first frame, press Set Lockdown Mesh /UV frame, and in the Stabilized Tracking tab. Now this is upright, which is kind of nice. And maybe just one more example to show, how easy it is to make changes to the system is we can make tighter adjustment points to keep an eye on just what we want to track. So I'm going to create them tighter to the shoe, knowing that we want to track the side of the shoe. Auto triangulate, set the UV frame, and then go into the Stabilized Tracking tab. And now you can really see how little motion there is after only tracking 2 points. So we would just pick some points that are easy to follow. So maybe this one, that, something like that. And I guess I won't go too crazy. And we could track them forward, or we could have them selected so they show up and right away move to the last frame. Now the amazing part is see how close these are already in the first frame and the last frame to their correct positions. Well, we can just go to the last frame here and make some adjustment points, nudging these into place. It actually shows you that 2 points is almost perfect for tracking this shoe. And now because we have adjustments on the last frame and on the first frame, when we press track all, it's going to refine, and these points are going to make sure that they start here on this crosshair and find their way all the way back to the last crosshair. So I'll press track all. So let's see what happened. I think looking at these 3 points, they probably look pretty good. Probably makes sense to make some minor adjustments in the middle here. But overall, they're fine. And you have to remember, when we're zoomed this far in, we're looking at some sub-pixel values that you'd probably never see in a shot that's moving this fast. I'm just a little bit of a perfectionist. Now, the only point that probably went a little bit crazy is this point down here, which I believe technically went out of frame. So let's see what happens. It's tracking well, right up until here. So when you see this kind of weird artifacting, you may be wondering what the heck is happening. Is that a bug? Well, it's actually not. This is the continuance of the frame out of frame. So if we go back into the tracking tab, let's look at our mesh. This is out of frame, and of course we can't track a point that's out of frame because there's no data. I'm just going to bring down the point radius a little bit, maybe let's say 20. And I'm going to scroll back and forth. So it's this point right here. And it literally just goes out of frame, and that's where that weird artifacting comes from. However, because we had adjusted it and we had started tracking from the last point, it did track as far as it could from either side. So it tracked from here all the way up until it went out. And then it tracked from here on the last frame where we made an adjustment all the way back until it left the frame here. So probably always a good idea. I'm just going to go back into the Stabilized Tracking tab to make adjustments outside of the untrackable area. This actually looks like it did completely fine. Maybe it's not totally necessary, but let's just say right there. Okay, that's good. And actually this frame, it looks like it got confused as it went out. So we would set this as not trackable, saying, okay, that's literally not there. This point right here does not exist on this frame, so we set it to not trackable. And then when's the next time we can actually see it again? We can see it here. We set it to trackable. That's what this blue bar is. So this light blue bar meaning it's trackable, dark blue meaning it's not, meaning it doesn't exist in the frame, and light blue again meaning it does exist all the way until the end of the shot. So again, to further refine this shot, we can come back to our first frame here, clear the mesh, auto triangulate, let's break the interpolation, reset the interpolation, because now these points are going to be slightly more accurate because they're not just following points 1 and 2. Now they're following the living points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'll just zoom out so you can see that. Again, go back to this last frame, and just in case anything might be looking strange, I'll look and try to confirm in the Stabilized UV Layout tab. It actually looks fine, but I'll go to tracking and press Set Lockdown Mesh Frame anyway, just to make sure any new points or interpolated points are behaving correctly. And I can move back into the Stabilized Tracking tab again. And at this point, you basically only add new tracking points where things are wiggling and where they need the help. So watching how this is moving, most of this shoe looks pretty solid, except I'd say the biggest area is probably right here. So if I were to create a point there, and this is another good way to judge stabilization if it's playing tricks on your head, is I can create this point and you can just see how it's moving underneath this still point. Just for some apples to apples comparisons, if I move the point here where we know this has been tracked, nothing is moving underneath it, right? So I'll just undo that. And I know that this needs to be tracked, so I'm going to move to the last frame. Actually, I can't even see how that's moving, so maybe not. There, I'll move there, create an adjustment, move further along, create another adjustment. And I believe that is the point right there. And that's the idea with the Stabilized Tracking tab, is that you just find the areas that are unstable and then you track them more. So I'll press Track All. So playing through, that point is tracking pretty well. Moving back to the Tracking tab, we can apply that to the mesh, set the Lockdown Mesh UV frame on the same frame, enter the Stabilized Tracking tab, and you'll see that area is looking much better. I'm just going to speed through this last point because it's bothering me. Okay, that's looking better. I'll just make one or two adjustments along the way. Good enough. I'll move back to the Tracking tab. Again, probably helps to go to your lockdown frame indicated by green. Clear the mesh, auto triangulate the mesh. And then the last thing I want to do to really show how well this is working is let's just remove these extension points. Because the extension points aren't necessarily always following the surface of the mesh, they're nearby, but obviously the top of the shoe isn't the same surface as the side in which we're tracking. So let's just take a quick look at how this is, and this should be almost completely stable, which it very much is. And as a final step, if you know you're only going to be tracking on the side of the shoe, it probably helps to keep your extension points relatively close, just within the bounds that you'll be painting and applying graphics. So I'm going to create some newer, tighter extension points. Turn on interpolation. And attach these to the mesh. And you can see that's looking pretty good. As a final step, I'm going to add graphics. I'm sorry, I'm just going to do this in After Effects, not in Resolve, but I had to pick one. Press lockdown. And you can see that the checkerboard is now attached to the shoe. So I'm going to go into the stabilized comp. Again, which is very much mirroring the stabilized image that we were looking at before. I'll put on some text. And I'll place my type here. Again, double checking that it's staying still relative to the shoe. A little bit of wiggle over here, but we're keeping the text inside of the area that it's not wiggling. We'll move to that outer comp, and now when I play this back, that text is on the shoe. And the last thing that everyone always has a question about is motion blur. To handle this, because there's obviously a ton of motion on this shoe, we just need to use CC Force Motion Blur. I'll find that effect, put it on here. That's way too much motion blur. I'll set it to native motion blur. In my comp settings, I'll set the shutter angle to something a little lower, maybe it was, who knows, 90 degrees, and the phase should be negative half of that always. And I guess we would just tune this until it feels like it's a blur that's roughly the same size as what we're seeing in this footage. So actually, maybe the shutter angle is 45 degrees, and then this would be negative 22.5. And maybe this blur looks like it's about the same length as that blur. And here's the final results with motion blur. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.